Well, hello, friends. Hope you're doing well today. We're continuing our walk through 1 Peter, and we're in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 today. Let me read the passage, and we'll dig right in. Peter's writing to wives and to husbands in this section. He says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered." Well, let's kind of lean into the uncomfortable language of this passage. Peter begins by saying, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands." And that's the same language that he has begun the last two sections with. He said, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors." So he's saying, be subject to human government. Then he went on to say, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect." And now he comes into the marriage teaching and says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands." And then likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. So this section here is the third of three applications that Peter is talking to, he says, sojourners and exiles living in the Roman Empire, followers of Christ. And he's counseling them for how they are to live distinctly, differently from their neighbors and co-workers, so that their conduct would glorify God and point others to Christ by their distinct way of life. So he's highlighted these three ways, how they respond to even unjust human government, how they respond to less than ideal situations like servants and masters, and how they respond to one another in marriage, in particular when marriage is less than ideal. He even mentions in here, in particular, what happens when a wife has an unbelieving husband. That's a less than ideal situation. So all of these illustrations, or all these examples, are dealing with less than ideal situations and how we as followers of Christ are to conduct ourselves when we find ourselves in these less than ideal situations. I'm so glad Peter writes about this. See, it's one thing to conduct yourself well when everything is going smoothly. This past year, things have not gone smoothly. A lot of people have become very irritated. With the pandemic, we've been isolated. There's been a lot of frustration. There's been a lot of strife in response to government restrictions. A lot this past year has really become exacerbated. It's like this past year, things were pressed and stuff was coming out of us. And a lot of what was coming out of us wasn't pretty because situations were less than ideal. So Peter here is talking about how do we conduct ourselves when things are less than ideal. And the principle he's talking about is how to be subject to others, how to live in a humble, deferential way when we are in less than ideal situations. Why would Peter call us to do this? To be deferential towards human government, to be deferential servants, masters, maybe it's an unjust suffering in the workplace, to be deferential in marriage. In every situation, he's calling us to not just live for ourselves in our way, but to live for the Lord's sake in deference to others. Why would Peter call us to do this? Well, let me give us two reasons why I think Peter is calling us to live deferentially, especially when situations are less than ideal. Here's the first reason. Because of who we are and how life is designed. One of the most fundamental rules or fundamental principles for us all to learn is that we are not God. None of us are God. We are made by God. God is in charge. We are not. And God loves to put reminders for us in life that we're not in charge. He gives us authority structures. He gives us parents who are in charge, not the children. He gives us employers who set the rules, not the employees. All of us find ourselves in structures where we are not the ones in charge. And those are wonderful reminders of the fact that not one of us is God. See, when we find ourselves resisting human authority, inevitably we find ourselves raising our fists at God as well. And God's reminding us that He alone is the one who is truly in charge. But also of who we are in terms of the fact that we are sojourners and exiles in this earth as followers of Christ. That we're not going to find our full fulfillment here and now. Now, all of us are living looking forward to a day when our hopes will be fulfilled. That upon Christ's return and the new heavens and the new earth, one day things will be as we desire. But no human government now, no job, no employer, no spouse is going to fully bring about the fulfillment we long for. And so we live in all of these relationships not expecting to be totally fulfilled. So we should be deferential because we know where our hopes truly lie. So we know who we are. We are not God. There's one God. We are sojourners and foreigners in this world that He has made right now. But there's another reason this passage points out why we should be willing to live deferentially, even in less than ideal situations. And that is because there's a proverbial wisdom to this kind of conduct, to this way of living. When Peter is addressing the wives, he said that when you live deferentially with your husbands, even with a husband who is not a believing husband, he talked about that they may be won over to Christ by your conduct. That it was the continuing to live in a loving manner, to continue to serve, continue to live humbly. That's the conduct that turns hearts. Not the chiding or the berating or the instructing. This kind of conduct has a proverbial wisdom to it, that more often than not, this kind of conduct works. Jesus told us to turn the other cheek. He wants to make a way for peace, and it's a deferential way. When we turn the cheek, we tend to create an environment that's more prone to peace rather than further volatility. And so this kind of conduct works. So why are we called to this? Because of who we are and how God designed life, and because living this way leads towards peace. Second question for us today, and that is, how can we live this way? Maybe we see the wisdom of living deferentially with government, in workplace scenarios, within marriage. It's one thing to recognize the wisdom of it, it's another thing to live it, especially in less than ideal situations. So especially in our marriages, how can we live this way, deferentially, humbly? I'm going to give us two thoughts here. First, to live humbly, deferentially, to be subject, we need to develop an inner beauty. Peter was addressing the wives, and he was counseling them to develop an inner beauty, a trusting and gentle spirit that would enable them to live in a manner to be subject to their husbands. It's really interesting language, developing an inner beauty, a calm, a quiet, a gentle spirit. It really reminds me of Psalm 131, where the psalmist is talking about this kind of spirit. The psalmist says, "O Lord, my heart is not lifted up," that's to be proud. "My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But listen to this. I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. See, a weaned child has learned that they can be hungry and wait, and eventually they will be fed. A child that's not weaned, it's not wrong. They're babies. They're hungry. They cry. But as a child grows in maturity, a child learns that they don't have to react to every stimulus, every desire, every feeling they have. They're growing in trust for their mother. So they can be calm and quiet as they wait for the food to come in its due time. And in a similar way, as followers of Christ, we learn to trust Him, and our souls can become calm and quiet. We can endure difficult situations. So, for instance, a wife can be in a difficult marriage. And unfortunately, that's quite common. And instead of reacting to every stimulus that happens with anxiety, with frustration, with anger, there can be instead a turning to Christ that produces a quiet in her spirit and an ability to relate to her husband, not just on how he is treating her, but on how God has treated both of them. That produces an inner beauty that is quite attractive. And Peter says, ultimately, will have effect in the marriage and brings honor to God. So one way that we live deferentially in marriage, especially for wives, is to develop an inner beauty, a character that is trusting and that is gentle, a character that's not seeking to control, but is looking to trust. The second way that we're to live deferentially in marriage is by developing an understanding manner. Peter's addressing husbands, and he says to husbands to live with your wives in an understanding way. Now, the same word, likewise, precedes his instruction to husbands as it did to the wives. And he's referencing all that he said earlier about servants, about citizens, being subject to others, being deferential. And husbands need to act this way too. To be understanding is really a deferential posture. He's not saying a husband is to say, make sure the wife understands him. It's saying for the husband to be thoughtful enough to understand your wife, to understand who she is, how God has made her, what she needs, how to best live peaceably with her. See, far too many guys don't take the time to understand their wives. It's about me and my agenda and my way. And Peter says that's not how we're to live. There's to be an understanding manner that's deferential. Now, when we do this, we're learning to take all of our thoughts captive to Christ. That when things happen to us, we're not just reacting as husbands, upset, angry, or even passive, but we are learning to be reflective, to think through what is happening by taking our thoughts to Christ. This gives us an understanding in our marriage that leads towards peace. So to summarize both of these instructions, to develop an inner beauty and to develop an understanding way, I think it's important to learn to be reflective, not reactive, in marriage. There's always going to be stimuluses, things that happen in marriage that can cause us to react. We'll always have those. But when we react, we tend to react according to our flesh, just wanting our own way. Instead, Peter is counseling us to become more reflective. Developing an inner beauty doesn't happen thoughtlessly. That requires thought. Developing an understanding way does not happen thoughtlessly. It requires thought. So as we learn to reflect upon what is happening around us, we start asking questions like, how could I respond in a way that will bring honor to Christ in this moment? Not just, why did she do that? Why did he do that? But how can I bring honor to Christ in this moment by serving my spouse? When we learn to live reflectively, not just reactively, we can live out the truths that Peter is writing about here, living deferentially towards others, so that we conduct ourselves in a way that points others to Christ. I want to close with some lyrics from a marriage song that I've really treasured for quite some time now. Andrew Peterson wrote a song on marriage called Dancing in the Minefields. And I love this song because Andrew brings out in his lyrics that not only are we called to lay our lives down for our spouse, but actually this is the pathway to life. I mean, God doesn't call us to live this way because he wants to harm us, but because he wants to help us. Living this way really is just one more way we find the mystery of the gospel to be true, that when we lay our lives down for others, ultimately for Christ and for others, we find true life. That true life is found when we lay our life down. Listen to these lyrics. Well, I do are the two most famous last words, the beginning of the end. But to lose your life for another, I've heard, is a good place to begin. Because the only way to find your life is to lay your own life down. And I believe it's an easy price for the life that we found. May God give us the wisdom and the grace to live deferentially in marriage this week as we come into the less than ideal situations that sooner or later we're bound to. God's best to you. Have a great week.